It was the kind of heat that stuck to your skin like plastic wrap. The sun had been bearing down on us for weeks, baking the fields and cracking the earth. Our town, Ridge Hollow, was no stranger to dry summers, but this year was different. The drought had drained the last drops from our reservoirs, left the crops shriveled, and turned every patch of grass into kindling. We were living in a powder keg, and all it would take was one stray spark. I was halfway through my shift at the hardware store when I saw it. A column of smoke, thin and pale at first, rising on the horizon like an ominous question mark. It was too far to be from the usual backyard grills or burn piles. No one in their right mind would risk an open flame in these conditions. "Hey, Alex," called Jenny from behind the register. "You okay? You're staring out there like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, snapping out of it. "Might be nothing," I said, though my gut told me otherwise. "Keep an eye on things here, okay? I'll call if I hear anything." Jenny frowned, but nodded. I grabbed my keys from under the counter and headed for my truck, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my chest. By the time I reached the Ridge Hollow Volunteer Fire Station, the plume of smoke had thickened into a dark smear against the bright sky. It was growing and fast. The station was a flurry of motion when I arrived. Our captain, Mark, was already shouting orders. His voice carried that edge of urgency we all knew too well. "Alex, took you long enough?" he barked as I jogged in. "Get your gear on. We're moving out in 2. "What's the situation?" I asked, yanking on my boots and grabbing my helmet. "Grass fire out near Cedar Creek," Mark said, pointing to the map pinned on the wall. "Winds are picking up, and it's spreading toward the outer farms. We've already got families evacuating." I nodded, my throat tightening. Fires out here didn't just threaten property. They threatened lives. Most of us were farmers or ranchers, and losing even a few acres could mean financial ruin. But this fire, it felt bigger than that already. We rolled out in 2 engines and a tanker, sirens wailing. The closer we got, the more the air thickened with the acrid smell of burning grass. By the time we reached the edge of the fire, the world was a hellish haze of orange and gray. Flames danced through the dry fields like living things, licking at fence posts and gnawing at the edges of a small cluster of trees. Mark shouted over the roar of the fire, "Fan out, protect the structures, and keep it from jumping the road. Alex, you're with me." I grabbed the nozzle of the hose and started spraying, the force of the water vibrating in my arms. But it felt like trying to hold back an ocean with a garden hose. The fire surged forward, relentless, driven by a wind that seemed to come out of nowhere. "Wind shift," someone yelled, and I felt the first tug of panic. The flames were no longer moving toward the fields. They were heading straight for us. "Fall back," Mark ordered. "Regroup at the tanker." I turned to follow him when I heard a shout from my left. A family, 3 kids and their parents, were sprinting across the field, the fire closing in behind them. My stomach dropped. The road they were heading for was already blocked by flames. "I'm going after them," I shouted to Mark, not waiting for his response. The air was suffocating, thick with smoke and heat. I reached the family just as the youngest boy stumbled, crying out as he hit the ground. His mother screamed, but I was already there, scooping him up in my arms. "This way," I yelled, waving them toward the tanker. But as we ran, a wall of fire roared to life in front of us, cutting off our escape. I skidded to a stop, the boy clutching my neck like a lifeline. The flames were too close now, the heat blistering. My radio crackled to life, Mark's voice cutting through the static. "Alex, the fire's boxed you in. Can you find cover?" I scanned the area, my heart pounding. There, a shallow ditch near the edge of the field. It wasn't much, but it might buy us time. "Get in the ditch," I shouted, herding the family toward it. I handed the boy to his father and crouched down with them, covering our heads as the fire roared overhead like a freight train. Minutes passed like hours. The roar of the fire was deafening, and the heat was unbearable. I could feel the ground trembling beneath me, as if the fire had a heartbeat of its own. I kept my radio pressed to my ear, listening for updates, praying for a miracle. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the roar started to fade. The wind shifted again, pushing the flames back toward the field. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but we had a sliver of hope. I helped the family out of the ditch, their faces streaked with soot and tears. "Go," I told them, pointing toward the tanker where the rest of the crew was regrouping. I stayed behind, watching the fire's unpredictable dance. This wasn't like any fire I'd seen before. It wasn't just destructive, it was deliberate. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The flames crackled in the distance, a sinister promise of what was to come. If the fire had a voice, it was the roar of a beast, primal and furious. By the time we regrouped at the tanker, the flames had already devoured acres of farmland. Even the air felt alive, trembling with heat and ash. My gear clung to me, damp with sweat and smeared with soot. Every breath burned, the smoke thick enough to scrape your throat raw. Mark's voice was steady, but his face betrayed the strain. "We're setting up a defensive line here. If we can stop it at the creek, we've got a chance to keep it from hitting the town." A chance. That was all we ever had against fire like this. It was impossible to predict, impossible to control, but we couldn't let it win. We spread out, laying hoses and digging trenches along the creek. The dry creek bed was the last natural barrier between the fire and Ridge Hollow. If it jumped that, the flames would tear through the town like a scythe through dry wheat. "Alex, get the pump running," Mark shouted. "We need water pressure now." I sprinted to the portable pump, fumbling with the controls. Behind me, the fire cracked and hissed, a monstrous thing hungrily devouring the fields. The pump sputtered to life, and I felt a brief rush of relief as water surged through the hoses. But the fire didn't care about our efforts. It surged forward, fueled by the dry grass and shifting winds. The smoke was so thick now that I could barely see the person beside me. Shadows moved through the haze like ghosts, firefighters and evacuees alike, all caught in the chaos. Radio chatter crackled in my ear, overlapping voices creating a discordant symphony of desperation. "Flames are climbing the ridge. Pull back. Pull back. We've got civilians trapped near the barn. Need backup now." The winds shifted again. Jesus, it's coming fast. I didn't know which call to answer. None of us did. Mark tried to maintain order, barking commands into his radio. But the situation was unraveling faster than we could react. "Alex, over here!" one of my crewmates shouted. I turned to see a young woman and her elderly father stumbling toward us, coughing and stumbling through the smoke. A wall of fire loomed behind them, moving too fast. "Keep going," I yelled, rushing to meet them. I grabbed the father's arm, supporting him as we ran toward the tanker. The flames were so close I could feel the heat on my back, hear the eerie, high-pitched whistle of dry grass combusting. We reached the line just as the fire surged again. Someone screamed, a sound I'll never forget, and I turned in time to see one of our own, Thompson, swallowed by the flames. His silhouette flickered for a moment before vanishing in the inferno. The fire wasn't behaving like it should. It wasn't just following the wind or the terrain. It seemed to leap across clear patches, flaring up in places where it should have burned out. At one point, I watched as flames erupted in a perfect circle around a lone tree, as if the fire had decided to play with its prey. "This isn't natural," I muttered, but there was no time to dwell on it. Mark's voice came through the radio again, sharp and urgent. "The wind's shifting. Get out of there now." I barely had time to process the warning before a blast of hot air hit me, carrying embers and smoke that stung my eyes. The fire changed direction like a living thing, cutting off our escape route. Panic rippled through the crew as we scrambled to find another way out. "Back to the creek," Mark yelled. "Move, move, move." We ran, stumbling through the smoke, the heat relentless. My lungs screamed for air, but every breath brought more ash and grit. Behind me, the fire roared, its flames snapping at our heels. I don't know how long we ran, but it felt like an eternity. We lost 2 more firefighters on the way, Bennett and Carson, both overtaken when the fire moved faster than anyone could have expected. There wasn't even time to scream for them. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. When we finally reached the creek, it was clear we'd lost the battle. The fire had jumped the line, consuming the dry creek bed and heading straight for the outskirts of town. Mark called for a full retreat, his voice heavy with defeat. "Get to the trucks," he said. "We've done all we can." I stayed behind for a moment, watching the flames advance. It felt like giving up, like surrendering to something we couldn't fight. I thought about the families we hadn't reached, the homes that would be ash by morning. Their faces haunted me, merging with the memories of Thompson, Bennett, and Carson. I turned to leave, but the ground beneath me gave way. I stumbled, falling hard into a shallow ditch. Pain shot through my leg, but I forced myself up, limping toward the trucks. The fire was so close now that it was all I could hear, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. When I finally reached the tanker, my vision was blurred, my breaths ragged. Someone, maybe Mark, grabbed my arm and helped me into the cab. The door slammed shut, and the sound of the engine drowned out the chaos outside. I collapsed into the seat, my head spinning. The last thing I saw before I blacked out was the fire, still advancing, still hungry. It wasn't just a fire anymore. It was a monster, and it wasn't finished with us yet. When the first drops hit my helmet, I thought I was imagining things. I was half delirious from the heat, my throat raw from smoke, and my legs aching from running through fire-scorched fields. But the faint patter on the metal was real. "Is that rain?" someone muttered behind me. I turned my face skyward. The smoke above us was thick, but I could see flashes of lightning cutting through the haze, and the patter grew stronger. Within minutes, the heavens opened, unleashing a deluge so heavy it felt like the air itself had given up and come crashing down. For a moment, nobody moved. We stood in silence as the rain poured over us, soaking our gear and extinguishing the smaller flames around us. Steam hissed and rose from the ground as water met fire. A cheer erupted from someone in the crew. Relief washed over me, mingling with the rain. But beneath that relief, something gnawed at me. The timing was too perfect. It wasn't just fortunate, it felt orchestrated. The rain continued through the night, drenching the dry fields and soaking the ashes. By morning, the fire was out. Ridge Hollow had survived, but barely. As the rain eased, the scale of the destruction came into sharp focus. The fields were blackened wastelands, the farmhouses charred skeletons. Smoke still rose in faint tendrils from the ground. The air was heavy with the smell of damp ash and scorched earth. We'd saved lives, but we hadn't saved much else. The townsfolk gathered at the fire station that morning, hugging us and thanking us for our bravery. The word heroes was thrown around like confetti. I accepted their gratitude with a hollow smile, my mind replaying the faces of the people we hadn't been able to save. Mark clapped me on the shoulder as I sat on the tailgate of the truck, my helmet resting on my knees. "You did good out there, Alex." "Better than good." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Get some rest. You've earned it." But rest was the last thing on my mind. A few days later, the fire investigator arrived. His name was Howard, and he looked as worn as the fields he was walking through. His boots sank into the mud as he moved through the blackened landscape, jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. I offered to show him the areas we'd fought hardest to defend, and he accepted with a curt nod. We walked in silence for a while, the only sound the squelching of our boots. "Unusual patterns," he muttered, crouching to examine a patch of ground. "See this?" I leaned closer. The burn marks formed a strange, jagged line, as if the fire had jumped unnaturally from one spot to another. "Could be the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it. Howard gave me a look. "Wind doesn't create perfect arcs. And look here." He pointed to another spot where a patch of grass was untouched, surrounded by scorched earth. "That normal?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not in my experience," he said. "And I've been doing this a long time." He stood and dusted off his hands. "Multiple ignition points. That's what it looks like. Someone set this fire intentionally." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought back to the way the fire had behaved. Erratic, relentless, almost alive. It wasn't just the drought that made it so dangerous. Someone had orchestrated this. The revelation haunted me as we moved into the cleanup phase. The fire station became a hub for coordinating recovery efforts. We distributed food, water, and supplies to those who had lost everything. Every time I passed a family huddled together, soot-streaked and grieving, the anger in me grew. Someone had done this. Someone had turned our town into their own twisted experiment. The letter came a week later. Mark found it first, a plain white envelope slipped under the station door. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a single sheet of paper inside. He read it aloud, his voice shaking. The fire wasn't an accident. Get ready for the next one. Silence fell over the room. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, colder than the rain had been. Is this someone's idea of a joke? One of the rookies asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head. No, it's a warning. That night, I sat alone at the station, staring at the letter. My mind raced with questions. Who would do this? Why? And what did they mean by the next one? Every shadow outside the window felt like a threat, every creak of the building like a footstep. I thought of the fire's strange behavior, the multiple ignition points Howard had found. Someone out there had set this disaster in motion, and they weren't done yet. The rain had saved us once, but the next time, I wasn't sure we'd be so lucky. The rain had saved us from the fire, but it hadn't washed away the unease. If anything, it left something heavier behind. Questions, suspicions, and a gnawing sense that whoever had done this wasn't finished. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. The words replayed in my mind over and over. Get ready for the next one. That's why, instead of sleeping, I spent my nights in front of my laptop. My small apartment smelled faintly of smoke, no matter how many windows I opened, a constant reminder of what we'd survived. I started where any amateur investigator would. News reports. Ridge Hollow wasn't the only place that had suffered from fires in recent years. Over the last 3 summers, towns in our region had been ravaged by suspicious blazes. Each one happened during a drought. Each one spread unnaturally fast, and each one left more questions than answers. In every case, investigators blamed a careless camper or an equipment malfunction, but the patterns were too similar to ignore. Multiple ignition points, erratic burn paths, and the fires always seemed to skirt properties just outside the main blaze. Properties owned by the same company, Landsecure Developments. Landsecure was a local developer with a reputation for swooping in after disasters, buying up land for pennies on the dollar, and flipping it into upscale housing. Their projects promised economic revitalization, but most of the time, they pushed out locals and brought in outsiders who could afford the steep prices. It was predatory but not illegal. What chilled me was the thought that someone might have set these fires on purpose to create the disasters Landsecure profited from. I dug deeper into the company's history. Its CEO, Nolan Greaves, had been investigated for arson years ago. The case was dropped for lack of evidence, but whispers followed him wherever he went. Greaves had a reputation for cutting corners and playing dirty, and his company always seemed to thrive in the aftermath of tragedy. I brought my suspicions to Mark the next morning. He listened as I laid out everything I'd found, his face growing darker with every word. "This is serious, Alex," he said finally. "Exactly. That's why we have to do something." But instead of agreeing, Mark shook his head. "We don't have time to chase ghosts right now. People are still rebuilding, and the station's stretched thin as it is." "Mark, this isn't a ghost. It's a pattern. And if we don't stop it, Ridge Hollow could be next." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You've been through a lot, Alex. We all have. Maybe it's best to focus on what's in front of us right now." I left the station fuming. I wasn't imagining this. I knew what I'd seen, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The next week, small fires started cropping up around town. One broke out in the woods behind the school, another near the edge of a cornfield. None of them grew large enough to threaten the town, but they were too frequent to be random. The first couple of times, people shrugged it off. Accidents happened, especially in a place as dry as this. But by the 4th and 5th fires, folks were on edge. It felt like someone was testing us, seeing how quickly we could respond. At the fire station, the tension was palpable. Mark assigned extra patrols to watch for suspicious activity, but we were running on fumes. Most of the crew was still helping with recovery efforts, and the constant false alarms were wearing everyone down. I tried again to bring up my suspicions, but the reaction was the same. "We don't have proof," Mark said, his voice sharp. and we don't have time to go on a wild goose chase. I felt like I was screaming into the void. Late one night, I decided to drive out to one of the recent fire sites. It was a field on the edge of town, the blackened ground still smoldering in places. I parked my truck and walked the perimeter, flashlight in hand. The night was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of burned grass. Something caught my eye, a footprint, faint but distinct in the ash. It was too large to be mine, and it was fresh. I crouched down, studying it, when a sudden noise made me freeze. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, crunching through the debris. "Hello," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer, just the sound of someone retreating into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. When I got home, I locked the doors and checked the windows twice. I didn't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I had a feeling I was getting too close to something they didn't want me to find. My suspicion was confirmed the next morning. When I opened my front door, I found a note pinned to it with a rusty nail. The paper was smudged with soot, the writing scrawled in jagged letters. "Stay out of it, or you'll burn too." My hands shook as I held the note. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. I looked around, but the street was empty. Whoever left it was long gone. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded as I stared at the words, dread coiling in my stomach. Whoever had set the fire wasn't just coming for Ridge Hollow. They were coming for me. The fire came in the dead of night. I was jolted awake by the shrill scream of my pager, its insistent tone filling the quiet of my apartment. My heart sank even before I heard the words crackle through the radio. Multiple reports of fire on the outskirts of Ridge Hollow. Wind speeds increasing. All units respond immediately. I threw on my gear, the heaviness in my chest mounting with every passing second. The previous fires were warnings, this was the real thing. The blaze was visible from miles away, an unnatural, towering inferno stretching toward the sky. By the time I reached the station, the horizon was a sickening orange, and the air carried the unmistakable tang of accelerants. Whoever had started this fire hadn't just lit a match. They'd poured gasoline on a monster. Mark was already there, his face grim. "Alex, you're with Engine 2. We're splitting into teams. Half are protecting the town, the rest are heading out to the fire line. It's spreading fast." "How fast?" I asked. "Faster than anything I've ever seen," he admitted. "It's already jumped the first fire break. That shouldn't have been possible." The fire was defying every rule, every containment strategy. It wasn't just burning, it was hunting. The drive to the fire line felt like racing into hell. Flames licked at the road's edge, and embers rained down like malevolent stars. By the time we arrived, the fire was a roaring wall of destruction, tearing through dry grass and farmland with a speed that left us scrambling to keep up. We set up hoses and dug trenches, working as fast as we could. The air was so thick with smoke that my lungs felt like they were coated in ash. Visibility was near zero, and the roar of the flames drowned out any attempt at conversation. "Hold the line," Mark shouted over the chaos. But it wasn't a line, it was a losing battle. The fire began behaving even more erratically. It jumped over wide gaps, flaring up in places that should have been safe. Entire swaths of land ignited at once, as if the fire had a mind of its own. "It's the accelerants," Howard, the investigator, yelled as he worked beside us. "Whoever did this planned it perfectly. They've created a firestorm." Panic rippled through the team as the fire shifted direction, cutting off one of our escape routes. Screams and shouts erupted over the radio, each one sending a chill down my spine. "Engine 4 is trapped. We've got civilians near the old mill. They're surrounded. We need backup now." I didn't wait for orders. Grabbing a spare oxygen tank and a portable radio, I broke off from the group and headed toward the mill. The fire seemed to close in around me, the heat so intense that it felt like my skin might blister beneath my gear. When I reached the mill, I found 3 people huddled against a wall, a woman, a man, and a little girl clutching a stuffed bear. Their faces were streaked with soot, their eyes wide with terror. "We're getting out of here," I shouted, waving them toward me. The fire blocked the main road. so I led them toward a narrow path I hoped was still clear. The heat was suffocating, the flames dancing closer with every step. That's when I saw him. A figure staggered out of the smoke, coughing and clutching his side. His clothes were singed, and his face was streaked with ash, but I recognized him immediately. Nolan Greaves. "You," I growled, my voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. Greaves looked up, his eyes wild. "Help me," he gasped. "You did this," I said, advancing on him. "You started this fire." "I didn't have a choice," he stammered. "They made me do it." "Who?" Greaves coughed, doubling over. "It's bigger than me," he wheezed. "They wanted the land, this town. They said if I didn't cooperate, I'd burn with the rest of you." Before I could press him further, a massive gust of wind surged through the area, fanning the flames higher. The fire roared toward us, and I knew we were out of time. "Run!" I shouted to the family. "Get to the creek." They hesitated, the little girl clinging to her father's leg. "Go now!" I yelled, shoving Greaves toward them. "Take him with you." The fire was closing in, cutting off my escape. I turned to follow them, but froze when I heard a cry behind me. The girl had dropped her bear and was running back to retrieve it, oblivious to the flames closing in around her. "Stop!" I shouted, but she didn't hear me. Without thinking, I sprinted after her. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding, but I reached her just as the fire surged forward. I wrapped her in my arms, shielding her as best I could. The flames roared around us, and I felt the searing heat on my back. My vision blurred, and my legs gave out beneath me. The last thing I saw was the girl's face, streaked with tears but alive. I whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe just her name, but I couldn't hear my own voice over the sound of the fire. When they found me, I was lying in the ash, the girl still cradled in my arms. She was alive, but I wasn't. Days later, in a neighboring town, another fire station received a letter. It was written in the same jagged hand as the one we'd received. This was just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.